Hey, Stephen.
Yep.
Before we begin, let me introduce myself. My name is Avi, and I'm a user experience designer. I'm also the founder of UX Salon, which is a group dedicated to advance the profession of user experience design. I'm really happy to have you here on this edition of UX on Coffee, which basically means we're going to have coffee, and as soon as our coffee is over, the conversation is over. This is the format of our little chat here. So it could be a informal type of conversation. I want to introduce myself, introduce you, speaker, author, and an experienced designer, and a friend. And I'm a really great person to know. I'm really honored to have you here. And we are here actually, this is a very special edition because, as you know, we are actually together in Bulgaria, in UX Sofia. We're here to speak. And why don't we just move into the physical world instead of just like, so, hey. All right, Stephen, cheers.
Cheers.
So as you know, we're just going to speak until the coffee runs out. Um, Tell me, what's going on with you today? What's new?
Let's see. We're both here together at UX Sofia,
Yeah.
where I'm going to be doing a workshop on design for understanding,
Okay.
and then I'm going to give a talk on really what it means to design experiences. Because I feel like we do a lot of things right and do a lot of things well, like as far as good UIs and making things usable. But I feel like if we look at film, if we look at game design, if we look at like advertising, look at other more mature industries, they've kind of captured what it means to design an experience. And I think we're still struggling with that. So that'll be the talk I give tomorrow. But again, the workshop is designed for understanding. I give that in about 2 hours, 3 hours.
Design for Understanding, that's also perhaps the title of your next book.
Yes, yeah. My co-author and I, Karl Fast, we're working on a book called Design for Understanding, and it is all about. It's kind of about this problem of we have way too much information, but what we don't have enough of is understanding. And so examples of this are if you're shopping for any like let's say Android phone. Like I want to go buy an Android phone, switch from Apple, right? There are 2-3 dozen options. I have no idea what's the good one, what's the cheap one, what's the mid-range one. There's lots of information, but there's not really good understanding. So it's that type of problem.
So, but understanding is vast. It's more than just understanding which one to choose, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's also, is it also understanding how to use the interface?
That could be part of it. Yeah. In fact, one of the things that I'll talk about is I give name to actually 7 types of understanding problems. So the Android phone example, that's actually a problem of comparison because you've got lots of options and how do I compare? How do I choose? And that's one, like I said, one of several types. You have other things that problems of relationships, just wanting to see how things relate to each other. This is often what we do when we go into a new space. We want to orient ourselves to that space and just know what are the entities, what do I need to know. So if I want to learn how to brew the perfect cup of coffee, it's I want to learn about relationships between things. Problems of causality, where through interacting with something, you can see cause and effect, and then you can see what happens if I move this, what's the effect, and you can learn through that sort of interaction. Most of them are things we can do to gain more knowledge. There's one problem of understanding I talk about, which is the problem of practice. And really, there's not much like we as a designer team could do to facilitate that. That's just the person really has to practice the thing. Mm-hmm. So if I wanted to perfect latte art, as an example.
Latte,
like making lattes and doing the art and stuff. I'm really just gonna have to practice at that to do that.
and so can you give me more a bit like what people can take from this book? I mean, I know you're working on it for over a year.
Yep.
So it must be very intensive.
Longer than that.
Yes.
So again, the topic is understanding. Really, how do we make sense of complex things or areas where there's too much information? And it was, I think in the early stages of the book, it kept wanting to become a book about data visualization or concept models or these types of things that we create and use to facilitate understanding. But as I've gotten deeper into it, it's less about those things that we create, and it's more about humans and what we know about the body, the brain, interactions with each other, how we use space around us, objects. And in doing so, what the book's gonna be about is really a set of timeless principles around timeless around understanding that could apply to like near-term screen and data viz types of problems. But fast forward the clock 20 years from now, let's say there's pervasive technology and embedded devices everywhere, and your whole Minority Report type of thing. The principles we're writing about will apply then as well, because we are trying to scratch beneath the surface and say what do we know about human behavior? Stuff you could go back 1,000 years ago, or you could go forward several decades, and this would still apply.
How do you know it? How do you know today? Give me an example of thing that would be timeless. One thing.
Sure. So there's a section in the book where I talk about how we use space to make sense of this, and make sense of things. And I think I fell into a trap of thinking about spatial arrangement in context of like a concept model, right, or a data visualization, because that's what I do a lot of. And so I kept wanting to talk about those things, and it became a very tactical book that's not timeless. And it was actually while I was having a lunch conversation with a friend of mine who works in the pharmaceutical industry, and he was trying to explain it to me, and it's a very complicated space. And he's trying to explain, and words weren't enough, just using words or using analogies. So he reached for like the salt shaker, and he said, okay, pretend the salt shaker is you, the patient, right? And then he grabbed some other, like a pepper shaker, and said, pretend this is the the 4 biggest entities you've never heard of, no one's ever heard of. And then here's the health, and he started explaining to it. And he was using these objects on the table as stand-ins for information. And that way, what it did is it kept me from trying to hold those entities in my brain, because now they're on the table in front of us. And then he started grabbing the sugar packets and showing how the money flows, all this stuff. And a light bulb went off, and I'm like, wow, he is using the spatial arrangement of these objects to communicate something that's a very difficult subject. And that's when the light bulb went on. It's not just him at this table, but how we sort silverware in our drawer, how we let's talk about the kitchen. If we're making a complex recipe, many of us will pull out all the ingredients, and as first we'll kind of chunk the ingredients. So here are the dry ingredients, here are the wet ones, if you're making a cookie, for example. Or if it's lots of spices, as we use spices in a recipe, we'll move them from one side of the counter to another as we use them, as a record of what have we not added yet, what have we added. So we're using space, we're interacting with objects to retain our meaning, to capture information. So then if you can talk about the patterns of what we're doing, so we're chunking things, or we're rearranging things, or we're repicturing things, those are timeless interaction patterns. And so that's the kind of stuff we talk about: interaction patterns, spatial arrangement patterns, visual encodings, these things. Like when we talk about visual encodings, I'm not just talking about concept models, I'm talking about our sense of vision and what we pick up on, and that, that hasn't changed.
Wow,
in
it
a long
seems
time.
like a really heavy-duty book. Lots of research, and can you give me what's the layers of? We talked about it a little bit earlier. What are the layers of understanding? Why is it important to communicate? Is it a design book?
Absolutely.
Why do we need to understand how to communicate better, or to understand each other better? Where can this go?
Yeah. So it's a design book, yes, but it's not just for designers. It's really for everyone. And we keep looking at books like Don Norman's Design of Everyday Things, where he, in writing the book, which I think showed up in airports, and it was a bestseller for everyone, he gave everyone who's ever got frustrated when they went to grab for a pull handle and it was a push, he gave them a language to describe what was going on there. I think that's called Norman's Doors now, right? Attributed to him. But he basically named and gave a language to talk about these problems or these frustrations we have every day, everyone has. And I think that's a big aim of the book, is to say, look, we are surrounded by these understanding problems. We may not be aware of it, but we have all these understanding problems. And if we can do 2 things: one, help people become aware of where there is an understanding problem, and then 2, give them a language, a vocabulary to respond, or at least think about it more critically, or what should have been done to fix that, we feel like that will be powerful. So as an example, this is a story I've been telling for a few years now. When my wife and I found out our son, who was 4 at the time, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, there's a very intense 3-day retraining process where you stay at the hospital and they teach the parents what they need to know. And at one point in that training, there's a form they give you, and this form is it's the thing you put on your refrigerator. It's the thing you're going to refer back to for the next 6 months, 9 months, a couple of years. It's the regimen of which types of insulin to give, when, how many amounts, how many carbs he can eat, all these types of things, when to check his blood sugar. And the form is, I would say, unusable. It's really complicated. And they have a nurse come in and sit down with you to explain the form. And he takes about 30 minutes to explain the form, and so you really get it. And there's some areas in there where if you misunderstood, you could potentially give your son or daughter too much medicine, right? Overdose, right? So it's a really critical form. Turns out it was designed by the legal department, and their goals were not to convey understanding. Their goals were to cover their butts, basically, right? And so I took that form. I took all the information that was there. Didn't change any of the information. I just changed how it was represented visually, and I did an after version that my son, who was at the time 4 years old, could look at and go, I know what I need to do. Because we wanted him to start owning his diabetes at that young age.
Was he using after you redesign?
Yeah, we put it on the fridge, and he knew exactly what he needed to do at 4. He could not have done that with the text form that they gave us. And so that's an example of I think most parents, and there have been thousands of parents who've gone through that hospital, they've been handed this form that's really confusing and not been able to, learned how to make sense of it. But what I'm hoping is, after Karl and I publish the book, for everyone who reads it, they'll be able to see things like that and say, someone didn't do their job. Someone didn't do this the right way. Yeah, you could say if it's a legal job, they did the job right, but if it's the form for understanding, maybe another department should have done it with a different set of checks in place.
It goes beyond, like what else can we use it for?
Yeah. So the laddering we were talking about, this is the fundamental structure of the book. Right now we're having a conversation, right? And I'm saying words. Maybe I'm using an analogy or a metaphor at times, but basically there's language being used, and you're hearing, and you're receiving these words, and you're creating an internal representation of what I'm saying. You're a picture of what I'm saying, and hopefully, if I'm clear enough, then what I think I'm saying is what you're hearing, right? And that's fundamental, like linguistics, communication, and that's the first couple of chapters in the book. We talk about how perceptions are formed in the brain, and we talk a lot about associations, metaphors, stories, things like that. So it's all about what's going on in here to form an internal representation. That's the first section. Second section, let's say that's not enough, and now I need, like my friend, I need to start using things in space, or I need to pull out pencil and paper and say, let me draw it for you. At that point, we're using our space around us. So that's all about external representations, and it could be a picture, it could be a graph, it could be a chart, it could be a visualization, it could be physical objects, whatever. We're putting thinking into the world. So that's the second section. The third section of the book is, okay, it's not enough just to put stuff into the world. Like sometimes it is, but you might want to grab that object and move it around to interact with it. Say, well, what happens if I move this over here? So at that point, we're interacting with information. And it may not just be you, it may be me, like arranging information in front of me to get it out of my head, and then rearranging to see different patterns, right? So there's a lot of understanding that comes through interactions. So that's the third section. And the final section is, and you can see this ladders up, it's for more complex situations. The final section is where things are so complex that you need to talk about context. What's the context that it takes place in, and coordination. So let's take a scenario like traveling through the airport, getting from my house to the hotel for this conference, right? Okay. The context, there's lots of different contexts. There's hotel changes. I think I had 2 layovers on the way here. There's lots of information distributed throughout multiple environments, and so that's when we talk about context and coordination. That's the kind of complexity we're talking about. And it could be me as a physical person moving through spaces. It could be something not quite a physical space, but a virtual space, like scientists working together around the globe to map the human the DNA project, right? And they had to have a standardized protocol and a standard way to share data back and forth and ways to communicate. So that was a context that was distributed. And the coordination, of course, was the platform that they were on and the database they used. So that's kind of the book: internal representations, external representations, interactions, context, and coordination. So a lot of breadth that we cover.
When is it coming? When is the book coming?
Probably winter this year, so like December, January, February.
Is this 2016?
Between 2016 2017, yeah. It's as you can imagine, a book of this breadth. There's a lot of every chapter could be its own book, right? But I think part of the value of the work that we're doing is we're surveying all these fields and trying to bring things together in a big cohesive picture that I don't think anyone has done. So you can find dozens or hundreds of books on each of the chapters we're talking about. Some of the chapters are kind of unique, like no one's writing about, but for some of the chapters, like the one on visual encodings, there's a lot of books that talk about that. Graphic design books dedicated that slice of the book. But I don't think anyone's brought them all together in a map quite like we do, and showed how all these pieces interplay and integrate.
You were saying that you were thinking about the chapter that you can make a book. What was that?
I mean, almost any of the chapters could be their own book. In fact, Karl has struggled. He's writing the chapter on interactions. And actually, it was going to be a chapter, and then it became 2. And I think it currently is 3. And then he had to like do some editing, because he's like, yeah, I could write a whole book just on interactions, which he could. That was his master's thesis. The book, or the chapter I just wrapped up, is on spatial thinking. So again, using space around us. And as I got into that, I realized I could write a whole book just on that. In fact, I'm developing a toolkit, kind of a spin-off from the book, to dive deeper into that subject. But that's some.
Can we show this?
Yeah, absolutely. So
you should hold it up, because
sure.
It's a bit lower.
So what you see here are a bunch of tiles, and this is would be part of a broader visual thinking toolkit. So going back to that example of the cooking in the kitchen and the ingredients and how you arrange things. This toolkit is really trying to give a language and a vocabulary to how we use space to arrange things. And so what you'll see here, there's actually 6 different colored suits. So you've got the sequence suit there. I've got one called arrangement. Those are actually the 2 related specifically to spatial positioning and how you position things in space. And so, for example, arrangement, you might put things into categories. So that's categorical arrangement. Like let's sort the laundry into like the lights, the darks, and the reds, right? So that's categorical. Then you have things like, well, let's sequence things. Like let's stick with the laundry example. I'm making this up. We're going to do your laundry first, and then yours, and then yours. So you've got some ordinal arrangement, right? If you put it on a scale, you might say it's going to take exactly an hour for each of your laundry. So we'll do yours at 1 o'clock, yours at 2, yours at 2:50, or and then you have things arranged on a scale. So those are all ways to arrange things. And then how you arrange them. As I was describing, I was kind of going from left to right. So that would be an example of direction horizontal sequence. So arranging things from left to right or right to left.
So these cards will create a common language to explain or to think about how we can communicate?
Yeah, so think of it like this. In chemistry, we talk about like compounds and things, but really the thing that a lot of us anchor around are the table of elements, right? There's all these elements that underlie everything, and water, right, is made up of H2O, hydrogen and oxygen. And I think to date, a lot of the conversations around visual models and visual thinking have all been about frameworks, and use this framework, use this business model canvas, use a Gantt chart, use a sitemap. But no one's taking it a level below, which is to say, what elements, what language, what grammar are we using to create that model in the first place? And I feel like if people can understand the underlying grammar, the underlying language, then they can tweak it they're more empowered to modify those models rather than use them. Or to use another example, so there's elements in chemistry. Think about ingredients in a recipe. So a lot of times the frameworks we're handed are like recipes. Like, here's a recipe, Avi, you can now make this. But if you understand the ingredients and the ways to mix different ingredients, together, then you're suddenly empowered to try variations on that recipe to come up with 900 more recipes. And so that's really what I'm trying to do with these, is say, is there a fundamental visual language behind virtually every model? And when I say virtually every model, I'm testing this with classic visual models like stuff Tufte, Edward Tufte would show. I'm testing it with data visualizations. I'm testing it with things that are visual representations that maybe we take for granted, like a clock on a wall. And the clock on the wall has the hands, the hour hand, the minute hand, has these notches around, and I look at that and I'm like, oh, it's it's direction, what do I call it, circular, because it's going around, and there's a repetition of time, and then it uses the interval ratio scale. So it's on a scale, so
Wow.
60 seconds, 12 minutes.
You really go deep here.
12 hours, yeah.
I want to ask on a personal kind of, since I knew you like for a couple of years now, you've always been meddling with understanding and creating these. What is this about? Like, why are you going there? Like, what's your passion here?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think I'm fascinated by just human behavior. Like we talk about in UX, we tend to talk a lot about. We tend to steer towards the output and the artifacts, like the design. But to me, like I've been fascinated by the human element, because like that's the part that's hard to pin down and understand. And so the first book and my deck of cards, the mental notes card deck, were a lot about human behavior, how we make choices, how we make decisions. I think this is just continuing that fascination, which is how do we make sense of stuff? And I kept coming up with these. I kept encountering these situations where things were confusing and fuzzy, and I would create models to make sense of it for myself, to explain ideas to other people. I mean, it was first and foremost I wanted to make sense of it for myself, and then I would share it with others to explain things. So a lot of the infographics and the models I've created over the years were in response to what I would now call an understanding problem. I wasn't calling it that at the time. And as people started asking me, how do you do that? I started responding to like, well, here's how to design a concept model, but I wasn't really scratching the surface yet. And so I think the longer I've sat with this, and the more conversations I've had and the more I've learned, it's like, oh, this is an understanding problem, and there are ways to respond to these. So I think this is really just scratching at human perception and human cognition. Like, how do we make sense of stuff and trying to understand that. So yeah, I think it's just that interest in human beings and behavior, perception, cognition, like just how do we make sense of our place in the world, those types of things.
I think that's great. So here's for understanding.
All right.
And I'm out of coffee, so we're ending this conversation.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing these moments with me. It was a pleasure as always.
Pleasure is always up. Thank you.